What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to the vlog. So, I haven't done one of these in a while, and today I wanted to talk. So, earlier this week, I posted my R5 tips and tricks video talking about in-camera lens aberration corrections. And I wanted to sort of expand upon that and talk about that a little bit more because, to a certain extent, I think as photographers, we have gotten to a point with the lens corrections and lens correction technology where we maybe need to start thinking about having a discussion about this. Maybe between us, maybe more so with the camera companies, and ultimately because we are the people who are buying the products, we are the people who are driving the demand for how things are driving, how things are being or going to be done. And so while I'm not going to say that any of us individually have the control over how the camera companies do things, we can certainly as a group say, hey, we're not interested if in stuff, these classes of lenses, if you're going to do this kind of thing. And I'm being nebulous here for a reason, because, well, it's what we're going to talk about. So, obviously, lens aberration corrections have been around for quite some time. They have been, I've used them in Lightroom for the better part of 10 years at least, if not more. And I'm not going to say they're a bad thing, because quite honestly, software lens aberration corrections make pictures better. They get rid of distortion that's not wanted. Or if you want distortion in the image, they get you to a point where you are applying controlled distortion and not just having to accept whatever the lens's level of distortion is. They get rid of chromatic aberrations, which aren't wanted. Or if you do want them, again, you want a controlled level of chromatic aberration. You don't want a just arbitrary whatever the lens provides. At least this is from my perspective. I want control over my images. Everything that I will control over the things that I'm doing in my images. So everything that I am going to put or not put in an image, anything that's a lens aberration, for example, chromatic aberrations, vignetting, distortion, I vastly prefer as a photographer, because for the vast majority of my images, I don't want it. For the images where I do want it, I want to be the one who's putting this much in or not that much in, or anti-vignetting, for example, in the image, as opposed to the camera simply, this is what the lens provides. So obviously, like I said, distortion correction or lens aberration corrections in software have been around for a while now. It's certainly one of those things that is enabled by digital camera tech or digital photography, because with film, you really couldn't do that in the same way that check a box in Lightroom and boom, it's done. The question that sort of I think we need to, as a community, discuss is how much is too much and how much is just right. Now, before I start talking about some more specific things, I do want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the lens designer's dance. It's the engineering trade-offs that the lens designers have to deal with so that we all kind of know where things are going from or coming from. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, the whole engineering aspect of this really does start with us. And that's why I said we're the ones who have to have the conversation about what we feel is most appropriate or inappropriate or whatnot. Because we're the ones who's ultimately going to buy or not buy the lens. We're the ones who are the engineers have to be designing the product. Like, they want to sell lenses, so they have to design the lenses that people want to buy. Now, obviously, there's always going to be some lens designers are kind of doing, a little bit in terms of isolation, but if we speak out and say this is not acceptable in this quality of lens, or this is just not acceptable, period, and we're not going to buy this, then the camera companies have to take note of that. So it starts with talking about like what we want. And generally, I think, in my experience at least, photographers want more range, more speed, and more resolution. So for zoom lenses, for the same class of lens, we want more focal length range. You can see this in something like Canon's 15 to 35 or 14 to 35. They're not 16 to 35s, they're longer than that. Or the 100 to 500 replaces a 100 to 400, so there's more focal, more range in that lens. We want more speed, so mirrorless fast primes, for example, are now pretty much universally f1.2. They're not f1.4s or f2s or something like that. They're faster. We have lenses like the Nikon Noct at 0.095. I mean, not that there weren't 0.095 or 0.95 f0.95 lenses previously, but not in the same kind of gist. The big one, in my opinion, really is Canon's 28 to 70 f2. Prior to that, prior to the Canon mirrorless system, there really was not, and there wasn't, a full frame zoom that was general purpose and f2. And so speed is becoming a thing. Speed's also becoming a thing because of resolution and because of sensor resolution. That the higher the resolution the sensor, the more diffraction limits where you see image quality improvements, and ultimately, as a result of that, the kind of faster your lenses have to be to give you working range. Now, that's a whole bunch more complicated and interrelated, and something I really should do another video talking about, probably will. But speed is something that is definitely something I'm seeing photographers want. And of course, if you want to separate yourself from somebody shooting on a cell phone camera, you need shallow depth of field. That's the big draw from what I've ever seen. The big draw to bigger sensors, full frame, medium format, etc., is shallower depth of field, better, more light collection, so better image quality is also a big factor there too. But shallower depth of field gives you more professional looking images by most people's standards. And of course, resolution. We're shooting with higher and higher resolution cameras, and if the lens is designed for a 20 megapixel camera, it does not do the job on a 45 or 50 or 60 megapixel camera, so the lenses have to be higher resolution. At the same time, as photographers, we want less of some things, namely price, weight, and size. It seems to be the big things. Now, I have never in my life met a photographer who has ever said, I want to spend more on camera gear for the same thing. And yes, lens prices are going up, kind of across the board. The mirrorless lenses that I bought for my EOS R have been the most expensive lenses that I've ever purchased, by and large, for the class and tier of lens. But as a whole, Canon, Nikon, Sony would have a much harder time getting away or getting to market with a, say, $5,000 24 to 70 f2.8 versus a $2,200 24 to 70 f2.8 or a $2,000. We just don't want to spend more money as photographers. I think that's pretty agreeable. Or if we're going to spend more money, we want to spend it on more gear, not more money on less gear. Weight. Simple reality. Weight sucks. I don't know anybody who says that they prefer carrying 45 pounds of camera gear around all day over 25 pounds of camera gear, presuming that both sets of equipment give them the same equivalent capabilities. Weight is just, the lighter things can be, the better they are. So in the case of, and this is something that's largely being delivered in mirrorless lenses one way or another, different construction techniques, more reliance on plastics instead of metals, better optical designs. Some of the things that mirrorless mounts and short registers have enabled or allow for better, smaller optical designs to be made. And of course, the third one is size. If we can pack more lens into less area, that's great. Now, unfortunately, size is one of those things that I think kind of marketing has deluded some people into believing that mirrorless cameras are going to be a panacea that solves the size problem. And that you will be able to have if the companies, camera manufacturers would just do the right thing, they would be able to give us like 4/3 size lenses with full frame size sensor capabilities. And the reality is physics doesn't work that way. And I think a lot of photographers have realized and understand that now. There are certainly things that mirrorless cameras do enable making lenses smaller, but at a given, at a certain point, there's just no gain that can be made. 500 millimeter lens isn't going to instantly, without dramatically changing the technology, so doing diffractive optics or phase Fresnel, as Nikon calls it, a 500 millimeter lens just isn't going to get that much smaller on account of it needing to be a 500 millimeter lens. Now, of course, there's trade-offs for all of this. So to meet all of these demands, the optical engineers at the camera companies and lens manufacturers have to do something to, have to design a lens. And this is where we come back to the whole digital corrections thing. So you could take the old school approach, and this is something certainly that was still being done heavily even with DSLRs. You certainly had to be done with film cameras, but with DSLRs, this was still a big factor in doing it optically. And of course, doing it optically requires, for example, more glass. You have to have, for every element that you have in a lens, that element is going to introduce some kind of aberration, whether it's a chromatic aberration from dispersion or a vignetting aberration from just the overall design of the lens or whatnot. To fix that, you have to introduce more elements to the design, by and large. Now, I'm not going to say that's the only way to fix it. There's other ways that things can be done, but by and large, you need to have an element for example, if you have a converging lens, that's the word I'm looking for. So if you have a converging lens that's made out of standard optical glass, that lens will cause dispersion. So red, green, and blue will focus in different positions from where, red, green, and blue will focus in different positions from that lens. Now, to correct that, you have to put behind that or in front of that or somewhere in the path a diverging lens. A diverging lens reverses essentially the direction or some other element. So you could do it with refractive designs, and this is where the big thing with refractive lenses comes from. That they basically, the refraction bends or causes the dispersion of light to reverse. So ultimately, you end up having to add elements to correct for things. And so as you add elements, of course, those elements introduce their own error or aberrations and errors, and so they have to be corrected. And so the whole process of designing a lens is kind of a process of going through and correcting the right things in the right places in the right way. You can also do a lot of this stuff with more exotic glasses. So you have things like EDUD, the ultra or the anomalous dispersion glasses that don't disperse or don't have dispersion characteristics that are similar or that are inherent to standard optical glass. So they may not bend blue light as far, or they may not bend red light as far, or they may not have as much dispersion on a whole so that the lens focuses all colors in a much tighter area. And of course, all of this raises costs. Costs across the board. So more lens elements means more weight. because there's more stuff there. It means higher manufacturing costs, because remember, these are precision optical instruments, so we're talking about having to precisely align more elements. And remember, being decentered is a problem. So there's requirements for more engineering to ensure that there's better centering, there's better tighter tolerances, etc., because of all these elements. Of course, the exotic materials, the blue refractive material that Canon uses, the anomalous dispersion materials, the ED, UD, etc., those are going to be not the same price as standard. They're going to be more expensive than standard optical glass. And in the case of a lot of them, they're going to be more expensive too, because you have R&D costs that go into developing them that the camera companies are working on. So blue refractive, it's a polymer, it's an optical plastic. It had to be engineered, and therefore it has an associated cost with that engineering that makes the material more expensive. Now, on the other hand, of course, more grinding, etc. Basically, doing it all in the lens makes things more expensive. There's higher costs association. Conversely, digital corrections, it's software. Software is cheap. It's not free, but compared to grinding a lens element or doing the engineering on a lens element, correcting for things in software is way less costly. And so easy aberrations to correct, the ones that chromatic aberration, lateral chromatic aberrations, vignetting, distortion even, can be corrected at an incredibly low cost versus doing it in lens optically. Vignetting correction is basically you map the vignetting of the lens design, and then you apply an inverse of the map. You brighten the image proportional to the map of the vignetting, and that's it. It's done. This also allows for trade-offs to be made in that there are some things that you cannot do in software. You can never correct. For example, if the camera doesn't have, or the lens doesn't have enough resolution, isn't high enough resolution, you cannot just correct in digitally more resolution. Now, I know, yes, there is software out there like Topaz Gigapixel AI, or the enlargement capability that Photoshop and Lightroom have, where you can double the resolution or quadruple the resolution of an image. And the software uses machine learning processes to sort of try to understand what image structure and data should be there, and then therefore applies that image data, that basically what they're doing is creating creating information out of nothing. So they're those software processes are not like the information that they're expanding upon may not or is not actually there. Now, that doesn't mean that they're worthless or useless or they do a bad job. It doesn't, as far as I'm concerned, mean that it also is not a photograph anymore. It's digital art because it has been modified. But first of all, it's not something that can be done easily in camera on a power budget that a camera has. You're talking software that takes significant GPU computation power in a computer to do the processing to up-res the image. Second of all, like I said, it's not real information. It's information that's being enhanced intelligently in a way that's not necessarily or shouldn't necessarily be creating things whole cloth that never were there. But there also are situations where there can be problems with that, especially with noise and so on and so forth. So optimizing a lens to have very good resolution at the cost of, say, vignetting. Well, vignetting is easy to correct. It's easy to correct in camera. And we now have a lens that delivers a hard to correct in post thing at the cost of an easy to correct in post thing. And so, it makes sense to have these kinds of trade-offs if you're being, if you're an intelligent lens designer, it makes sense to leverage the trade-offs the best way that you can to maximize the cost effectiveness of the lenses, to maximize the image quality and the capabilities of the lens for the things that you cannot simply correct in post, and to minimize the costs overall of the process. Now, the problem here is, at least as I see it, is that this all can be taken to a step too far, I think, in some respects. And as things currently stand, all of the mirrorless camera manufacturers, at least, I'm kind of going to lump everyone in there, even though I have not completely researched it, but at least Canon, Nikon, and Sony, all of these companies have jumped on the digital lens aberration correction bandwagon and are doing digital lens manipulations or corrections to sort of make this dance in engineering work. Where this becomes, I won't say problematic is actually probably a good word for me, is first of all, marketing. I always kind of end up harping on marketing, but if we're not informed of what's going on, or it's glossed over, or the marketing kind of indicates something other than the reality, to me, that's a problem. It's always a problem from a consumer, standpoint, to not know what I'm getting into. There's sometimes where things don't matter. There's other times where marketing kind of goes over the line. So where this, like as I said, all the manufacturers are doing it. The question to me, and the question that I think we as a community have to be more open or have to discuss or talk about, is where the line in the sand is. What is a step too far? Is just a very heavily distorted by past standards lens beyond the pale? Or does something have to go further than that? Or is going further than that really not a problem if it's disclosed, for example, in the marketing, or if it targets a specific niche in a specific market that can't be necessarily targeted any other way? And I think Canon is very much at the forefront of where this discussion and why this discussion is coming up for me. So Canon has right now 4 lenses in their RF product line that require mandatory distortion correction. Those are the RF 24-240 f4 to 6.3 IS-USM, the 24-105 f4 to 7.1 IS-STM, the RF 16mm f2.8 STM, and the RF 14-35 f4L IS-USM. Now, 2 of these lenses, the 16 and the 14-35, are just distorted. And they're distorted enough that Canon has decided that there's too much distortion inherent in the lens for them to be comfortable with just like letting it slide. And so for those lenses, there is distortion correction turned on mandatory in camera, and software like Adobe Lightroom will also forcibly apply distortion correction unless, for example, you go and you dig around and you remove the correction profiles. The other 2 lenses, the 24-240 and the non-L 24-105, go what I would consider to be beyond the pale. At 24 millimeters, they mechanically vignette. The image circle does not actually cover the entire full frame. And the cameras internally stretch out the image so that you don't see the vignetting, the mechanical vignetting in the viewfinder. And they do this in the JPEGs, and the mechanical vignetting still shows up in the RAWs because RAWs still are just raw sensor data. But when you open them in Digital Photo Professional or Lightroom, the distortion correction will be applied to the lens and you can't turn it off. Now, there's a lot of things that I think Canon probably could have done to get around this. They could have, I mean, see, I guess this is where the question, for me, this is a step too far. Conversely, the 24 to 240 has a 10x zoom and it's a really compact lens, and you only run into this distortion correction being sort of abused or overused, in my opinion, situation at the widest angle setting. It's not intended for R5 / high resolution / professional photographers. And in doing what Canon did, they're delivering a lens that gives you that 10x zoom on your, for example, EOS R6 that is cost effective, or probably more so cost effective than it would be if they simply tried to do it all optically. Now, I'm going to be straight up about this. I won't buy any of those lenses. I think they went too far. That's my opinion. That I would really, there's a part of me that would really like to have the 24 to 240 just as I can grab one lens and go on a vacation kind of thing and not have to worry about taking a bunch of glass. But I don't really want to give up. The trade-off there, as far as I'm concerned, is too high. The other two lenses are just distorted. Heavily distorted. And they're not even so heavily distorted that they're unusable or something like that. They're just beyond where Canon felt that the lens should be. And as a result, they do distortion correction. It's mandatory in camera, and it's enforced in most third-party software that does distortion correction. So it will be enforced in Lightroom to have distortion correction. The lenses don't mechanically vignette. Now, this is more in line with something that I'm kind of more comfortable with. I'm more like, because this is more in line with that traditional distortion correction of a standard lens kind of thing. They're not super cropping in and saying, okay, well, this is just, it's just a lens with pretty significant distortion at certain focal lengths, at least in the case of the 14 to 35. Now, there are ramifications for this if you're a Canon shooter in that you can't do multiple exposures because the distortion corrections and so on and so forth. But the question kind of still stands is, at least for me, really, in the case of the 14 to 35 f4, it's an L lens. It's Canon's premium line. And is that acceptable to kind of have this situation, to enforce this situation? Now, of course, the reality is there's really nothing comparable that I can think of that you can compare it to. So you can't turn around and point to, say, Nikon and say, well, look at Nikon. Nikon has a 14 to 30 f4, and it's not image stabilized. It's close, but it's not really comparable. Sony has something, again, in that same range, but I think theirs is a 14 to 24 or 12 to 24. It's not really comparable. Maybe Canon could have done better. I don't know. But again, drawing lines in the sand for a premium, top class, top shelf, whatever you want to call it, lens, is this a reasonable line to draw? Like, should the L lenses, or in Nikon's case, S lenses, not have mandatory, be better corrected optically? And I know I'm bagging on Canon because this is something that, well, one, affects me because I'm a Canon shooter, and two, they are, as far as I can see right now, the most egregious. They've gone the longest or the furthest on doing this kind of thing, on doing the distortion, you know, exploiting software distortion correction. But they're not alone. Sony does it. Nikon does it. Nikon's situation, in my opinion, is actually a bit more complicated and confusing than Canon's is, in that there's some lenses that have, I mean, there's the same kind of situation. So some lenses have mandatory corrections applied. For example, the Nikon 24-200 4-6.3 VR has mandatory lens corrections that are applied in camera. Are in post-processing. Everything, as far as I can tell, Nikon Z mount is image or lens aberration corrected in camera when you're looking through the viewfinder and when you're shooting JPEGs and you have no control over it. Which I'll get to that in a second because there's a discussion there. All lenses, as far as I understand Nikon's system, all lenses have, the Z system at least, all lenses have profile correction data in them that is stored in the NEF file or applied to in-camera JPEGs or TIFFs when you shoot those. The third-party software, like Lightroom, will mandatorily apply lens corrections to some lens and camera combinations, but not all. I've had people say that they're applied to all corrections, but then in doing some Googling and some testing on my own, for example, a Nikon Z9 with a 100-400 does not have lens corrections applied at least in the latest version of Lightroom, so 11.2 or Lightroom Classic 11.2. The 100-400 on a Z9 doesn't have mandatory corrections applied, but the 24-200 does, which I guess makes sense in some respects. Some of the older Z series cameras, the Z7, I've read posts that says, from various people saying that, like, the Z7 always applies lens corrections in Lightroom, if it's shot with a Z7, but if it was shot with a Z7 II, it doesn't always apply lens corrections in Lightroom. That may very well be a very well be a bug in Lightroom and not a behavior in general. And this is the sort of the problem too, of course, is the software all has to work together correctly. So this is being done everywhere. Now, what's the photographer's argument to all of this? Because, I've talked about the engineering. I've talked a little bit about where I stand as a photographer with some examples, but I think there's a photographer's argument to be had sort of in general. And part of that, of course, is going to be the old graybeard, it's always been done in the lens, it should always be done in the lens kind of thing. And quite honestly, I don't find that to be tremendously persuasive, largely for the reasons I've already talked about, which is that it's just going to make lenses expensive, more expensive, and heavier, and bigger, and clunkier. And while doing things in the lens maximizes image quality in some respects, it also, as I said, maximizes cost, weight, because of more elements, etc. Reduces flexibility because you end up with like smaller zoom ranges potentially to have the appropriate optimizations and fixing things. But there's also aspects to it where, like, most photographers probably don't think about. So as a photographer, we always think about things in terms of, or lenses in terms of f-stops. We don't think about things in terms of transmission. So, which is, one of those places where it's real interesting when you cross over into the video cinema world side of things. Over there, everything is transmission, not f-stops. Over in photography, everything is f-stops, not transmission. Now, ideally, they'd be the same things. However, they're not. And the more elements that you put in a lens, the more, basically you also run into two problems. One is transmission gets dropped because glass is not 100% transparent. there's a small amount of light that is absorbed, that is dispersed. It doesn't make it through. Additionally, you run into reflections. So anytime you have a change in refractive index, so air to glass, glass to air, there are reflections that happen. You can do things to mitigate them, and camera manufacturers do. You have air sphere coating, nano coatings, multi-wavelength, quarter wavelength, etc. coatings that get put on. They work to mitigate that. Not all elements are coated in a camera lens, and every time you have a reflection, you have the opportunity for contrast loss. So every time there's that change in refractive index, so air to glass, glass to air, you have the opportunity to lose contrast, which we also don't want to lose. So it's not, the bigger question, I think, sort of is that it's not free lunch any way you cut it to do it optically. Of course, the other side of things is thinking of the pixels. So lenses or lens corrections are destructive at a pixel level. Things have to be stretched, things have to be bent, things have to be moved, things have to be distorted one way or another. If you're doing chromatic aberration corrections, depending on the correction, how destructive the actual correction is will vary. Like distortion corrections are very destructive. Of course, the question that always I come up with on this is, where do you draw the line? So if a lens is so distorted that I don't know. Like I said, there's inherent limitations, of course, to doing things in pixels. So that's kind of one side of the photographer's argument, I think. The other side of the photographer's argument, or the photographer's argument that I would present, becomes something more a line of, yes, but our concern as photographers should be pictures, not pixels. And I think there's far too many photographers these days who are just way too caught up in pixels. They are way too caught up in, I need a higher resolution. I've already got a 50 megapixel camera. I need a 60 megapixel camera, or an 80 megapixel camera, or a 100 megapixel camera. They're just way too caught up in the pixels, not the pictures. Now, yes, it is absolutely true that the picture is made up of pixels. But at the same time, the picture is more than the sum of the pixels. And the content of the picture, the quality of the picture, is going to be 90+% of what makes the picture good and emotionally resonant and etc. For the viewer. It's not going to be how good your pixels are. And especially with the resolutions that we have in cameras now, we're so far past the point of where a reasonable, normal person is going to be able to see pixel level detail that it really doesn't matter that much. So with that in mind, I kind of come back to the point of, yes, things may be destructive at the pixel level to make these corrections, but how do we balance that again? Because, as I said, how do we balance that against costs and against weight and against the quality of the picture as a whole? So if I'm able to carry more gear or lighter gear to get me into a place hiking for a landscape that I couldn't have easily gotten to, does it really matter that my 45 megapixel sensor is only effectively 30 because of the lens distortion that's being corrected, lens aberrations that are being corrected? Or does that image still work? I mean, because, it's easy to sit here and talk about more, but when push comes to shove, remember, this is, even as end users, as photographers, this is all a balancing act that we have to kind of work with it. So I want to wrap this up kind of with one last thing, which is I want to talk real briefly about a couple of implementation details that I really like and I really don't like. And again, I'm going to be slagging on Canon here, and I'm going to be praising Nikon a bit, which probably seems a bit weird for me, but whatever. It's just the way the engineering worked out. So Canon continues in their mirrorless cameras to give you control. And normally I'm of the opinion that control is a good thing, that giving me more control over what my camera does to my images is something that I want to have. So Canon allows you, with the exception of the lenses that require the lens aberration corrections to be done, Canon allows you to pick in camera whether you want the camera to do chromatic aberration correction, distortion correction, vignetting correction, and diffraction correction, or they also have a advanced processing thing, which is digital lens optimizer that does some of those corrections along with some other things in addition to that. Now, my problem here, and why I'm going to slag on Canon for this, is control, I think, is fine if the manufacturer that's giving us the control clearly explains to us the details of what that control does. Now, some of the things that they have that we can turn on and off, it should be pretty obvious for most of us as photographers. We shouldn't be that confused by what vignetting correction or peripheral illumination correction is doing. On the other hand, other things like digital lens optimizer and diffraction correction, the manual kind of implies, well, like digital lens optimizer, Canon doesn't even tell us what the whole shooting match is. Now, they just kind of say it makes the pictures better from the lens, but they don't really get into the details. And not getting into the details makes it very difficult, for me at least, as an end user, to know whether I should enable it or not. It makes it very difficult for all end users, because then you can't just read a paragraph and say, oh, okay, so this corrects this, this, and this, and it has these specific side effects, and that's all it does. I don't need that. I'm not going to use it. If you don't have that, you end up either having to test it, which is difficult and challenging for most people to, put together a effective test of these things. It's even difficult for when I did my video on in-camera lens corrections to put together what I would consider an effective test to look at all of the things or try to isolate all of the things that the digital lens optimizer can correct. So in that vein, I think what Nikon's actually done in the Z cameras is actually a way better solution. And I know there's probably some people that would complain about it because they've taken control away. There is no in-camera control over the use of lens aberration corrections. They're active all the time. The camera does not, so if you're shooting JPEG or TIFF, you have no choice in the matter. The lens images get corrected. If you're shooting RAW, the RAW files are RAW files. They contain just the raw image data, so the raw data isn't being manipulated, but the agreement, essentially, Nikon's own software enforces this, but so does Lightroom and so does Capture One, as far as I understand it, is that the images, by and large, for the most part, will be corrected. And again, it's a little bit confusing because some lenses force it and other lenses don't. So similar to what Canon's doing, some cameras seem to force it, which may be a bug, for example, in Lightroom and not as in the whole. But in camera, at least, you don't have an option to mess with this. It's on, it's taken care of, it's done. And to me as a photographer, I actually like this. I actually agree with this approach in this case because I don't have to think about what's going to happen. I don't have to care or know or read a manual to understand, should I flip this setting on or that setting off? It's being done for me. And if I'm a JPEG shooter and there's plenty of JPEG shooters out there, especially in photojournalism. If I'm a JPEG shooter, I am getting corrected images out of the camera. I don't have to worry about distortion. I don't have to worry about vignetting. It's giving me a higher quality image in my deliverable, with basically me not having to dive into processing anything, even to deal with basic lens distortions and basic lens optimizations. The other thing that Nikon's doing that I really like is embedding the lens correction information in the raw files. And I think this is well, I shouldn't say I think this is a better way to do this. I think this is a good way to do this, but it really also, to me, it depends on the actual extent of what's being done. So the way both Canon's RF system and Nikon's Z system, one of the selling points of the new lens mounts is that they have enough bandwidth to be able to store in lens profile and correction data and have the camera download it from the lens at the time the lens is being used. And now I haven't seen anybody who's completely reverse engineered the protocol or reverse engineered the protocol at all at this point. So I'm not exactly sure on what the implementation is for how this all works. There's certainly better ways and worse ways that it can be implemented, but the short of it is that the lenses can support storing correction information. Now, because the lenses can support storing correction information, in theory, every lens could have corrections for its specific aberrations. So if you have specific distortion or specific chromatic aberration, because remember, not every lens, even though they're engineered the same way, not every lens is assembled exactly the same. There's tolerances, therefore there's errors, therefore there's going to be potentially slightly different aberrations from any given lens compared to the ideal or the engineered norm. So in theory, both Canon and Nikon can have in lens, instead of having a generic profile for all of the 24-70s, they can have a profile where, as each lens comes off the assembly line, it's stuck on a test machine. The test machine analyzes the lens's vignetting, chromatic aberrations, etc., builds the profile for it. Again, this can all be automated in the manufacturing process, so it's not like this would be a huge time sink or something, and it would generally be part of the quality assurance to make sure the lens was should be part of the quality assurance to make sure the lens was properly assembled in the first place. Build the profile, upload it, flash it into the lens, and then when you get that lens, the profile that's being applied is actually the profile for that lens and not the profile for that type of lens. Now, Canon obviously isn't putting the profiles in their raw files. They're relying on a generic profile that Adobe is either, for example, in the case of Adobe, that Adobe's producing, or that Canon has produced in the case of Digital Photo Professional, or that, it's not being done quite the same way that Nikon's doing it. So that's one potential pro of doing it this way. Another potential pro of embedding the profile stuff in the lens and then into the raw files is for third-party lenses. Now, the third-party lens situation for both Nikon and Canon is pretty minimal at best right now. There's some manual focus stuff. So in theory, this whole idea of having profiles in the lens that the camera reads also means that, in theory, third-party lenses could have their own profiles that the camera reads, so the camera knows how to apply the corrections for third-party lenses, and that it puts that information into the raw files, which means that when you take it into Lightroom, you don't have to wait for Adobe to profile a lens, and you're not, again, getting a generic profile, you're getting a profile that's potentially specific to your lens. And the only real con to all of that, doing this way, which, like I said, I'm I like this method. The only real con is that it adds what you could call redundant information to the raw files. At least that's assuming that the camera manufacturer, like for example Nikon, is using a generic correction profile for their lenses and not individually tailoring the profiles or testing the profiles for every lens. So if it's a generic profile, then all it's doing is making the raw files a little bit bigger. It's not actually helping. And it would almost be better for Nike, from a size standpoint. Now, we're talking about pretty trivial sizes, so this is probably not that much of a big deal in terms of overall what the situation is or how much this is impairing things. But from a straight efficiency standpoint, not having the profile embedded in the lens would make the raw files slightly smaller. But, all that said, like I said, this is, I think, a good way to go about kind of dealing with the whole lens correction thing. Now, I do want to touch on something that I didn't touch on earlier, and I should have touched on it, and this is my concern kind of going forward, and then I'm going to be done. So with DSLRs, because there's an optical viewfinder, there's nothing to hide behind. Camera manufacturers can't do something like what Canon has done with those two lenses that mechanically vignette, and then kind of completely cover it up and make it very difficult for anybody to determine, is the lens, is this a product of the lens, the bad resolution or whatever, or where does this lens really sit? With mirrorless cameras, this is a situation that's somewhat more difficult. Now, as far as I know, there are no camera companies that are actually doing something as, like, say, egregious is what I'm calling egregious, is what Canon's doing with the two lenses that mechanically vignette, and then making it impossible or very, very, very difficult for anybody to determine that it's happening. In the case of those two Canon lenses, if you shoot RAW and you open the RAW file in something other than Lightroom, or you disable the correction profile in Capture One, or you use DCRAW or LibRAW, you see what's happening. The RAW files still preserve the information. So if you're doing something to test the image quality, imatest, etc., that kind of thing, you're still going to be looking at the actual raw sensor data. And as far as I know, there are no camera companies currently that are messing with the raw data sufficiently to create the situation where the raw files are distortion corrected to cover, well, I won't say to cover, but to obscure what the actual lens is doing. Now, my concern is that that's an actual possibility now, and there's no easy way for us as users to quickly or readily identify that this is happening. Now, I am not saying that any of the camera companies are going to do this. This is at least not anytime soon, possibly ever, but this is also, again, who knows, maybe they will. So because they control the image pipeline completely, and it's electronic, they can, like, if you went out and you bought and you're a JPEG shooter, you bought a 24 to 240 Canon RF lens and you put it on your camera and you went out and started shooting, other than the fact that certain camera functions don't work, like multiple exposure mode, you would never know quite how egregious, in looking at your images or looking through the viewfinder, the camera mechanically vignettes at 24 millimeters. You wouldn't know. You'd have no way to tell. You would have to hope that a lens testing, somebody who's doing tests and reviews, notices enough to dig in to notice to actually find out if that's the case. Whereas, like, in the DSLR world, that wasn't something that could be done. You looked through the viewfinder, and if there was mechanical vignetting, you saw it in the viewfinder because you it was optical, you couldn't hide that the same way that it could potentially be hidden in a mirrorless camera. So I'm going to invite invite the comments here. I know this has been kind of long. I wanted to do this a lot shorter, but it is what it is. Where do you stand on lens aberration corrections? Where do you stand on drawing a line for lens aberration corrections? I'd like some feedback, because I kind of shared where I stand, but I have not completely made up my mind on this issue yet, and I'm not entirely sure that I will anytime soon. It's complicated, and it's easy to be real old school and real, this is how it's got to be because this is always how it's got to be or been, but maybe that makes us or causes us to miss out on some positive things going forward, or better, smaller, lighter lenses. Or like I said, maybe it doesn't matter in certain market segments. Like maybe the line is really just premium versus consumer, and if the consumer level lenses deliver good pictures on on cameras, does it really matter that much that they're heavily distortion or heavily corrected in software versus the premium lenses that are more expensive, obviously, but are better corrected optically and rely less on lens corrections. So like I said, let me know in the comments. I'm interested to see where a lot of you guys stand on the whole issue of distortion and lens corrections. So again, as always, if you found this interesting, please smash that like button to let me know. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. If you know somebody who might also find this interesting, please help them and me and share it with them. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.